Most leaders don't fail because they lack intelligence. They fail because they make decisions that are disconnected from who they really are. Over time, those decisions compound. They drift from their values. They compromise under pressure. And eventually, the leader doesn't recognize the purpose in the mirror. Today, we're talking about the decisions that define you in business, in leadership, and in life. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Self-Leadership Lab. I am beyond excited today because I have Angelo D'Amico on the show, and we're going to talk about leadership in a way that we haven't talked about it on the show before. We are going to talk about it as it applies to both the organizations we lead and then how we make the decisions both for ourselves and that organization. So without further ado, Angelo, why don't you introduce yourself and introduce the topic that you brought to me, and let's start the discussion.
Hi, Bobby. Thanks for having me on the show. Happy to be here. I think today we're going to be talking a little bit more from an applied perspective, hopefully staying away from the too fluffy kind of stuff, getting into, what people who have some authority in different organizations face when they make decisions. I think we're both in that position in our own personal lives. And so I think we can bring some value there for the audience. And I think we want to tackle when we make those decisions, what are the kind of things we need to consider so that regardless of the outcome, we still can put our head down on a pillow at night and feel good about it. And that if things don't turn out the way that we anticipated, that we don't, beat ourselves up or have a lot of regret about that. So I think there's some things we can talk about that lead to good decision-making in practice, where we can stand behind decisions regardless of how they actually perform.
Yeah. No, and I think this will be very interesting conversation because so often we think about decisions at either angle, right? We don't combine the two. It's either organizationally or personally, but yet at the same time, organizations are run by people, hence the word, human resources and, all the human factors of it, but it's very easy to lose sight of it. So in that regard, what do you think the biggest, I guess, what do you struggle with the most when you think about making decisions as a leader of your organization, for the organization, vice yourself and the well-being and productivity of your employees?
Yeah. So, I think firstly, I'll say it's pretty tempting when we do need to perform to a certain degree from a profit and short-term perspective. We have some sort of pressure about the system and its performance, and that can make us tempted to look at people as inputs into that system. So grappling with how do you treat people as an end in themselves, that's a Kant idea, but I think it's a really important one for people who are in business, because we are so pressured by short-term performance to kind of squeeze the most that we can out of things. And so one thing that I find challenging, or something that I need to remind myself of in all of my decisions and on an everyday basis, is that we do have to balance this idea about what we might call executive performance, this thing we all know about, which is like, how do the financials look? What are we going to say to the shareholders and to the directors and any other stakeholders involved, versus what's our responsibility for stewarding the company, this stewardship discipline about, how are we orienting the company for the longer term? And that might be profitable too, but it might not be evident in the short term. So, if you treat people a certain way, going back to your question, in the short run, you might extract more from them. But what if you cause their burnout or their lack of faith in the organization, or their lack of participation, or higher turnover, or poorer customer relationships because you have people who don't believe in what they're doing, on the phones and in the emails? So every decision, I think we could probably come up with examples for how we would need to balance this shorter term executive performance about financials and profit and that sort of thing, versus this stewardship idea of orienting the company towards integrity, its values, the longer term stability that it needs if it's going to continue being profitable, say 20 years down the road, and even maybe when you turn it over to somebody else in the long run.
Yeah, where do you see the biggest challenge? Because, as a leader, you are responsible for the financials, but the employee a lot of times is only responsible for the job. And they sometimes see that the financials is a blocker to either their success or their promotion. They don't buy into the money so much for their organization, but more for them. So we always talk about getting someone to believe in the mission or believe in the product or whatever we're selling or doing. But how do you do that, or what are your suggestions to do that when the employee that you're trying to motivate or inspire has very little benefit, at least not in the same faction as like the leadership and the stakeholders, the ultimate people. How do you balance that in how you run your business?
Yeah, good question. I think I guess one disclaimer that we ought to both give, I think, at the front of the front end of this is that any answer we give is not a full conclusion that we're claiming we've sorted it all out, right? Anything I say is going to come from a place of, hey, I've been doing it a little bit of time. I figured it out some stuff, and there's a whole bunch that I still am trying to figure out, and I think that'll just be ongoing. I have my limitations just like anybody. So, for those people, inevitably, who feel as though they'd like more for themselves, but they work in a business that maybe doesn't have the resources to give them individually more right now. I think a couple of ideas or concepts to hold while you're making that decision is, number one, try and decouple for that person how you value them as a person versus how you compensate them, right? So a dollar figure isn't a reflection of what I think about you. Right. You could be my mother and do the job. It doesn't mean you're going to get all the companies. We're not going to put the company under just because you have a short-term need. And I think that as people with authority in companies need to be considered with a long-term and broad range of people. So if I favor what a couple of people really want, who are really demanding, am I destabilizing the whole thing for the long run and for all the people involved? I think that we have to make sure that sentiment and compassion and sympathy aren't in isolation applied to meet everybody's demands fully. Because if everybody was paid or compensated, in a short-term way that only considered that we really appreciate them and respect them and like them and know that they're of value and care about the fact that they're all part of families who love them and have mortgages. If we package all that up and we say we're going to meet everybody's short-term demands, whatever they might subjectively be, that's not going to be something that gives them job security in the long run either, or anybody else. So we want to decouple. Here's what you earn versus here's what I think you're worth as a human being. They're different things. What you're getting from the company is constrained by the company's resources, right? And we have to be concerned with that. And so a little bit of transparency might go a long way in a situation like that, just to say, we are going through a bit of a hard time right now. Here's what we're doing to help get through that. But in the meantime, these are our limitations. And then if there is a way to tie their package in terms of what they can earn to outcomes that would actually help the company get to a place where it's not as resource constrained and could give them more because the company is also getting more, that's a great win-win to say, hey, here's how you could get more. Here's what the company needs to achieve. And if you can achieve that for the company, then you can get more too. But just like I said earlier, these decisions aren't perfect, and it's very rare to come up to a situation where it's so clean as to say, oh, check, link these things together, away we go. It's usually a lot muddier and grayer than that. And so I'm just kind of giving these as thematic things to incorporate in the decision that I think balance the short and the long-term needs, the value of people, but then how those blend together and where on that spectrum you land is not almost for me to say, because every situation is going to be slightly different. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, no, 100%. And I like exactly what you said too, that, I'm certainly not an expert in business or in the leadership, because every day is a new challenge to me. And, you and I are in completely different sectors. I'm more in the services sector, and I think you're more in the product sector. But where do you think, I always struggle with the amount of information that we give out, because, you'll read all these books, knowledge is power, and, misinformation leads to speculation. It can be a cancer in an organization. I mean, there's plenty of case studies out there that we can read, but where do you personally see that fine line about, demonstrating what you said earlier about the health of the company and the long-term success versus some of the things that are more like private and not to introduce worry to the employee along the way?
Yeah, for sure. I guess if I understand the question, correct me if I'm wrong, is like, you don't want to paint a picture like the sky is falling and give all of them all the burdens that you're meant to be considering. There's a little bit of, as a person in a leadership role, there's a little bit of a responsibility to take the volatility out in the world and within yourself, and then smooth it out before you before you extend that message to everybody else. That's part of the role. So if I understand your question correctly, it's like, how do you take that care, but still give them enough reality that they understand what we were just talking about? Is that kind of the question?
Yeah, that you nailed it.
Yeah. So, firstly, I don't react to really short-term things. So the message can't change all the time. And I think the message can't be threatening or coming from an emotional or defensive place. Oftentimes it might look like we're anticipating a downturn in the market. We're not sure how long it's going to last, but we think at least this duration. We think it could be as severe as this percentage of decline. We have been proactive in advance of it to help get us ready for it. So we're gonna be as proactive as we can to get us to the other side with as minimal damage as we can. But just, I want to be clear that we are going to be going through a time that's going to be challenging for the company. I do think we can get through it, but I think we're going to all have to keep in mind that for the company to get through it, it's not going to be, as easy. Decisions are going to be harder. Spending decisions are going to be tighter. Budgets are going to be smaller. We're not going to be expanding in a lot of ways. And we hope that you'll help see us through and we can all kind of thrive on the other side. That kind of message does say, things are about to get hard. But it doesn't say, hey guys, we're in the red. Things are like this. We've got 2 days worth of money left, or else you're out of here. Like, there's nothing threatening and volatile about it. And I think that's really key, because people, especially when they're hit with news that is destabilizing, cling to the worst case. They kind of translate what you're saying into the thing it could mean the worst for them. And then they go home to their families and have that conversation, and you're not involved in it. So you don't get to keep it on the rails. It can spiral any way it wants to. So, don't plant the seeds for that chaos, even in their personal lives, I think is a really important thing to think about.
Yeah. Yeah. Great answer there, and a lot to think about there. I think too, a lot of times what we fail, or I've fallen as a leader in the past, is that whole, what you said earlier, that compensation isn't how I think about you. And, building that in the good times is probably extremely valuable for when you do get a situation, like you said, where we're going to go into rough times. And that open communication, I mean, we love to say communication, but what does that mean? It's like when and what's appropriate, how much is appropriate, and all that. But I think if you set the standard early on in your relationship with an employee or a group of employees, and not the fluff of how was your weekend or how was your soccer game or whatever, go beyond that, like really connect with them as a person, because then the message that you package. And I love what you said about don't change it all the time. I've worked in corporations when I did that, and they would change, the wind would change the decision, and day to day you didn't know what you were going to do. And of course the water cooler conversations, the speculation grew, and people were worried, and then false, things come out. So what do you do personally to develop these relationships early to avoid exactly what we were just talking about? They kind of panic and, the flight response that may occur when we do have bad news to give.
Well, I think, again, I'm not claiming to do it perfectly, but one thing that's really important is that people know it isn't just in these bad times that we're gonna have this message. So like you said, in good times, we're gonna want to make the point. We value you. So they trust that you and the company have a certain character, right? So I think when bad times hit, that's going to be the safety net of their kind of spiraling. So if I know a person and their family and their pets and their hobbies, okay, check. That's a good thing. I want that anyway because I value these people. But I think it also goes a long way to making sure that they trust us in the long run. I think also having this trail of crumbs of past decisions, that it's not about whether all those decisions that you make turn out right over the last, say, 5 years, but it is about, they can point to a a consistency about how you go about making decisions that will develop that stability and trust. So that when you get to those hard decisions, they say, yeah, you haven't made every right decision. You do seem to have limitations as a person and as a leader. That's fine. But I think you're predictable in terms of like, I trust you'll make a decision with these factors in mind. And I trust that you'll make decisions with, excuse me, with me in mind as a person and us as a staff and share and stakeholders. So, um, I don't want to sound too kind of fluffy about that because that's exactly the opposite of what I'm trying to do here. But having all the time having conversations with people that get deeper than the work is really important. And then people will know that your decisions are consistent if when you make decisions, especially unpopular or difficult ones, you're really clear about the method of decision making. Then they can start to predict the way you would make decisions and feel good about that. Having said all that, none of that is a seatbelt that says now they're not going to worry. That would be, I think, naive to think we could achieve that altogether.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's sometimes the flaw in leadership is like, because we can't put the seatbelt and the safety net around every single person, sometimes we just avoid it altogether. It's like, why even try? But yet at the same time, it goes back to the golden rule. You got to treat people how you would want to be treated. So have you ever, as a leader, made a decision and put yourself in the employee shoes before you made the final decision and instituted policy or a change?
Yeah, I mean, I think an easy, like a short-term one, for example, would be something like when the pandemic happened, our company had some period of time, a handful of weeks, where we just demand tanked and we just weren't doing very well. Money wasn't coming in. We started to bleed, right, from a cash perspective, and we would have been. It would have been easy for us to kind of just chop a certain number of people out and say, okay, that's what you have to do. But our company has a track record even prior to my being there. And we followed the same approach, which is, okay, let's say we need to cut down from, say, 5 days a week to 4 or 3 days a week. We're all going to cut down the same amount of time and the same amount of pay. I'm not excluded from that just because I'm the president of the company. I'm going to take the same percentage pay cut. But I'm going to be there the 5 days. I mean, those people are going to not be asked to be there. Like when you're not getting paid, you don't have to be there. I'm going to be there to help keep trying to solve the problem to get you back as fast as I can. So that was something that we did to share pain. That wasn't just pushing pain on other people that aren't, say, leaders in the company. It keeps everybody together in a little bit of suffering without giving anybody a massive amount and sparing other people any. Secondly, when we returned to work full time, which was, again, it was just some weeks afterward, we paid everybody for the days they didn't work. So if we said only come in 4 days a week for, say, 4 weeks, they would have missed 4 days of pay, one per week. We paid them for those 4 days because even though they didn't come in and work those days, it's not like they could call up the bank and say, hey, I'm only working 4 days. Can you reduce my mortgage for me? We understand that people have real lives to live. And if we value them as people and if we see our role as giving them good lives, then we should do those things if we can. So we did top them up for all the time that they didn't work in that time phase. And we gave everybody also a bonus on top of that to thank them for their resilience. So that's an example of where we could have saved a ton of money. Things were really volatile and uncertain. We all shared the pain. Even executive people were part of the pain. And we still did, I think, the right thing in the end, which is to acknowledge that you don't just look at people and say, well, you weren't here, so I'm not paying you. Too bad for you. You say, this is a really hard situation. You didn't ask for this any more than we did. I'm sure that hurts you when you go home and try to buy groceries. Why don't we just make that right now? Let's get back to level with you. But I guess that's kind of what I mean too, is the next time we get in a bad scenario, having dealt with it that way, you hope that people feel a little bit less destabilized when uncertainty is on the horizon because they know, you might not always make the perfect decision, but you will make a decision like that with those types of values in mind. So that's, I think, an establishment of the way you make decisions and the way you value people that helps them not kind of spiral when the next bad thing comes up.
Yeah. That's a great story, and that's a great benefit to your employees. It's nice to hear things like that because I've certainly heard the other side of the coin where 20% reduction meant 20% less in pay and never got recouped. And in my industry too, we have all these government shutdowns, and you see how different companies respond, and so it seems to be always different. But I like that you've got that consistency. So the next time, and again, I think maybe you can't do the same thing next time, right? Because ultimately you're in business for business. And I think a lot of times the employee has to think about one or two things, but you as president of your company, you're thinking about 40 or 50 things. I mean, there's so many elements that most people don't even know exist. And I found it very helpful in the rough times in my years of business is explain exactly what happens, because most people just see inflation or they see the cost of electricity or groceries or something going up, but they don't see the trickle on, what does it cost to insure the company, to insure the health insurance, the vision, the dental, things that you provide as a benefit, but at the same time that's giving them money, but they don't see it. So a lot of times I'll just open the books and be completely honest and say, hey, listen, this is what we paid, last month, and this is now what it is. And sometimes those are 24 to 30% increases, which is kind of unheard of to an individual, right? I mean, when groceries go up, they may go up by 2 or 3% over time. It may aggregately get up to 20% or something like that, but it's over time. Whereas, like, as you know, insurance policies can be, $1,000 today and $1,300 tomorrow with no recourse, no, really anything. I mean, sometimes they'll give you a month in advance to know, but you have to react to that. So like, because we can't really ever know what anyone else is thinking other than ourselves, what did you do, or what are you thinking about to instill or glean the thoughts of others to help you in decisions later on? Because you talked about this whole consistency thing, and obviously consistency is only relevant if it's, the person itself accepts it as consistency, right? Because, times change, and they'll think about it at the time of the pandemic, which is what, it's hard to believe, 6 years ago, right? 6 years ago this week as we're filming this, it shut down. Yeah, that's hard to believe, right? So what do you do to try to capture like the thought processes and I guess the feedback from your employees on how you mitigated the situations?
I'm going to answer that. I just want to touch on, I think you said something important, which was that we all don't know each other's kind of the extent of the variables that somebody's going through. So from a business leader perspective, staff don't understand necessarily. They're not responsible for the certain amount of burdens that people in the leadership positions are. And likewise, I think in leadership positions, we have to understand that we're not always privy to how things are changing on the personal side for people. Somebody just had their kid needs braces and they didn't expect that. And now they got a bill come in, or something happened to their family and they're trying to help them out. And so I think exactly what you said, and it goes, like, we all have to keep that in mind, right? And so we can't always make the heartfelt, happy decision. Like the one I explained to you with the pandemic was possible because we had the ability to, right? So if that had gone a different way, perhaps we wouldn't have been able to do that, right? My hope is that by acting in a certain way over time, that when we can't, we can at least explain why we can't. Like, to your point, here's the way costs have changed, or here's the way, revenue has changed. But then we also have a responsibility, if we're going to be in positions of authority in these companies, to fix those problems. If there's an issue with the model, either it could be a cost part of it, or it could be a revenue part of it, it could be the value proposition, whatever it is, the relationships that you're leaning on, we do have to be proactive about, now, how do you fix that? Because if that's a problem, okay, fine. Organizations don't exist to be operating under those types of conditions. People like us are meant to change those conditions so that we can achieve a more constant, profitable model, and give everybody, ourselves included, that security and stability over time. So it's fine when that's not the case, but we ought to be doing something about it wherever possible. So I agree. We have to know what people are going through. They have to know what we're going through. And we can't always have the sunshine story. So coming back to your question, which was, sorry, can you restate it just one more time?
I guess how do you glean the perspectives from those that you influenced?
Yeah. So for example, after the example that I gave you, obviously people are going to come up and be appreciative about that, and sometimes surprised and appreciative about that. So, very obviously that they're happy about it. I would say there are times where we try to do the right thing for the company where there's instability. And so, for example, I can remember giving cost of living adjustment as the only raise for people at some point, because there was actually contraction in our company, 7-figure contraction year over year one time. And it wasn't that we were in jeopardy of falling out of business, but it was a significant change year over year. And there were people awfully upset about only getting a cost of living. Now, those people are making just as much. They would be in the same roles, doing the same work, but they are upset that they got only cost of living as a price, as a wage increase. And I mean, it's not our role to go in there and say, well, hey, your feelings are wrong. Here's why I'm right to do what I did. I think that's just a tit for tat thing that you're going to get into that maybe betrays trust. And those people sometimes can hold that grudge for months. Like, they can last a long time, right? I'm imperfect about how I handle this maybe, but one thing I do is I try not to get into a conversation of defending it. It's what we had to do. We believe is the right decision for the company. In no way is it a reflection of you as a person. That's all I have to say, really. I try to make sure I'm treating them no differently. I'm not walking on eggshells around the person. Nothing's changed. We're just going to do work as usual. And I'm hoping they can resolve those feelings. I'm not responsible for everybody's feelings, but I am responsible for what I communicate. So I try to be consistent. And I know that sometimes people won't be happy with me and the way I made decisions. And maybe in time, I'll think of a way to do it better. But if it's the best way I know right now, then I'm content with that.
Mm. Yeah, you got to do your best and forget the rest a lot of times. And I want to take a little bit of a pause and kind of sidetrack this a little bit, because what you said to me kind of resonated in a different way than I originally asked it. As business leaders, executives of companies, we are looking at a lot of different parameters. And this show and kind of my whole thematic is self-leadership, how we can lead ourselves so we can lead others. And a good indicator of that is both the self-assessment, self-evaluation you do of your own stuff. And typically we only talk about this in the leadership qualities, your values, your creeds, what you live by as a person, which are very valuable. But something that kind of popped in my head while you were talking, while a business is looking at all these elements, the person in the business often isn't. They just see it year to year increase. I want to live the same. And I'm not preaching at anyone, and I certainly don't try not to make anyone feel bad. But do you think there's a lack in society where people are observing kind of like what's coming and preparing for it, much like the business had to do? You said, you had to reevaluate when you had the 7-figure, fluctuation. It seems to me like as a society, we don't do that ourselves. I know that's kind of like just me thinking out loud here, trying to work something out in my head, but do you have any thoughts on that could, or encouragement you could give to people about things that they could do to kind of like forecast their futures a little better themselves too?
In a business context or a personal one?
I think in a personal context in this one, and then we'll bring it back to business in a few seconds, but.
I mean, far be it for me to tell people how to do that in their personal lives, but, yeah, I think my go-to would just be all these kind of normal things. Like when I look at, you look at your home expenses, you look at the things, your behaviors in your life and what you value. I think that's all there. I don't know that I have a ton of comment about how people personally ought to buckle up for these types of things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if we look at it in the perspective of business, I mean, we're looking at, sales, we're looking at cost of goods, we're looking at demand, we're looking at all these little factors. Whereas like a lot of times on a personal level, and I am certainly guilty of this, a lot of these increases, you don't really plan for them, right? And so you don't make the trades that you're going to have to do in something else. Maybe I take a little less leisure, budget to pay my electric bill or these sort of things. And so much of this is really out of our control. I just this morning I commented to my wife that our electric bill is now as expensive as it is in the summer, and so it shouldn't be, because at this time we have a gas furnace and that's what heats the home. So why is our electric bill so high? Well, part of that's my responsibility. I didn't realize that electric prices were going up so high, but then it makes me wonder, well, what is that going to do in the summer? Like if it's going up 2x
Yeah.
in the wintertime, what's it going to do? And then you make adjustments to that. And a lot of times, I mean, again, obviously the pandemic took everyone by sort of surprise, but do you do anything like report to your about the market, about the industry, and kind of bring people up to speed along the way about what is going on? I mean, I know we always have like program management reviews and quarterly reviews and stuff in my company, but I find, and I'm kind of guilty of this, and you brought this out of me, sometimes I'm a little guilty of talking about the things I can influence, the external factors outside of my organization. So I'm bringing it back to business again, not to confuse anyone,
Yeah.
but you know, maybe as a leader I could do a better job to then help them prepare personally for what may be coming.
Yeah. Now, are we talking about communicating again to people within the organization, or kind of like directors and people who are overseeing us?
You know, I would say too at the employee level, because I'm making the assumption that the directors and all those have a deeper dive and a better knowledge about this. Because I mean, I'm sure, you know, like let's just say the most junior employee in the company probably doesn't know about supply chain pricing and the increase in this and that. I mean, again, they might hear it on the news that, like, you know, during the pandemic, I think chips went up. So if whatever you produce had chips, you know, that one you could kind of see coming. But you know, maybe they don't know about like the price of, you know, whatever. I mean, I know there's a lot of talk of tariffs and things like that impact things, but maybe bringing that to a realization to people instead of thinking about it
Sure.
obtusely, they can really like hone in on say, hey, this is where we're seeing it and this is what we're watching out for. And maybe too, it benefits the organization too, because if you tell people this, maybe they can bring information that they hear or that they've researched to the forefront that maybe you as the leader may not even see. So it's kind of like that shared responsibility.
Yeah. So, okay. So we have a process. I'll try to answer this in the business way, something that
Sure.
I'm kind of versed in, and then I'll maybe touch on the personal side. Just if we're going to entertain the game of helping people, just helping people, regardless of if they're maybe in a business or not, and just then I'll try to touch on that, but I might not be this strong on that side. So, like maybe don't feel like I necessarily have always the right to kind of tell people what they ought to do, but um,
Right.
in the business side. Um, we have a process of evaluating internal and external risks that apply to the company. You know, we're going to weight those things based on what industries we're involved in and the kind of work we do and the factors that are affecting us, you know, whether they be trade policies or labor availability or technological changes or global logistics. Like we've had times where costs of shipping things globally could double. So where you might spend, say, $10,000 or $12,000 getting something, or $4,000 getting something from overseas to us. Now that might be 20 or 25, and that could happen in a week. It doesn't usually happen that way, but it has happened that way, you know, and that's a little bit relevant right now because I think there's some supply routes that are affected right now with different things going on in the world. And so, whether they be, you can look at the factors. I guess we should understand what our levers are. So when routes for logistics or oil prices are changing, so might your shipping. If certain industries are expecting that, you know, so in the example you gave about certain groceries are changing, well, you should know if are we involved in packaging? Are we involved in that industry specifically from an agriculture perspective or a product perspective? Those are the kind of obvious things. We've got a business unit that has to do with equine products, and they're more relevant to people, I think, who have just changed properties and are looking to outfit their new properties with upgraded outfittings in their facilities. Now, when the real estate market slows down as a byproduct of that, so would the number of people re-outfitting these equine facilities. There's just less exchange of properties. So part of it, I think, is, and it's really hard to do. Even when I was I was a business consultant for a decade before I was doing what I'm doing now. And we did try to help some companies identify what are the levers kind of on an economic basis behind your demand or lack thereof. So we can kind of foreshadow that and have some leading indicators. It's really hard and it's usually so multivariate, but it can be useful to at least know that here are some levers that are participating in that, even if you can't define them all. And, there are things about from a bank perspective, from a central banking perspective about bond yields and things like that. If you start seeing, we won't get into all that right now, but if you start seeing certain patterns changing, that will indicate a change in spending sentiments. And really, a recession doesn't necessarily mean people have no money, but does mean they're not spending that money, and sometimes a sentiment of uncertainty causes conservative behaviors. I mean, conservative in terms of not frivolous spending, but being conservative about our finances, right? Saying, you know what? I'm hearing things are on the horizon. Let me kind of save a little bit more. Let me have a bit of a buffer here. And that's a responsible thing to do. So if everyone does that, that means we're all spending less. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy about that downturn kind of happening because we're all spending less. That represents lower demand. Now we've created the recession we thought might happen. So as a business and as a person, we have to be doing those things. I know that we have to be careful. So in a business side, we are facing pressures from whether it be directors or other stakeholders or our partners or other people like that, not just at the staff level, but actually at the level of people we answer to who are not staff that are maybe have authority over us to some extent. We do have pressure to prioritize what I called at the beginning of this conversation, that executive performance, the financial side, the short-term side. We need to see it now, and it is a tough situation if those people don't have the wherewithal to appreciate that there's something called stewardship that's important for their long-term value too. We have to issue a lower dividend or extract less out on behalf of people who are at that level and leave more in because we're trying to make sure we have it for a rainy day, which we think is around the corner, things like that. So whether it be an investment or just a protective mechanism, sometimes that means less reward. We have to convince the people of the highest authorities they should accept less reward right now in the best interest of the long term. And so they're worth educating too. They have to value because they're the ones creating leaders that have so much pressure they can't make decisions for the long-term interest of the company. And then what kind of decision will those leaders make? If the people they answer to only value short-term, they're going to make decisions that way. And they're going to do things that kind of cripple the company in the long run. And from a staff perspective, that's not what you want. You don't want a company that you can work for and do really well for 2 years, then lets you go because, or folds because they didn't think about it. Now that's going to happen naturally to some companies. That's not necessarily a result of an irresponsible company, but sometimes it can be avoided. And you hate to see it happen when you think it could have been avoided. Then jumping to the personal side, which you asked me about, institutions who were meant to trust would allow us to say be over leveraged to take on more debt than we ought to, or spend in a way that that might not be responsible. And so I think my background is in economics in terms of my education background, and you always want to divorce fixed costs and variable costs. So like your gym membership. If you have a monthly payment membership, that's a variable cost. You can cut that down, right? But your mortgage is a fixed cost. You're not going to adjust that tomorrow if something happens. And so I always think, am I living my life in a way that my variable costs are adjustable enough that if something happens that's realistically bad, the fixed costs won't drown me? So there's a little bit about having the savings, but it's a little bit about architecting the cost base. And so we maybe take for granted in business that not everybody has that even education, or no one's even explained that to them. What are the differences between a fixed cost and a variable cost? And what we're saying is, which costs are you obligated to, even if things turn down, versus which costs can you actually turn off if things go down, like your Netflix account or something. If anyone on Netflix is watching, sorry. But I'm canceling Netflix if I can't afford it, right? But I can't cancel my mortgage on a dime.
Right. Yeah. And again, I like what you said. I'm also not in a position to give anyone personal advice on how they live their lives, because each one of us are different. And certainly that's not what I'm trying to do. I just want to bring as much awareness. And I think you did a beautiful job of showing the way a corporation looks at it, and then the way we can maybe transfer some of these skills as they apply to us, to our own personal lives. Because we're all in this together, although a lot of times it feels like we're in it separately. And I think understanding what's going on around you can benefit the way you lead yourself, but also how you empathize and react with others. So thanks for that answer. And I know I hope I didn't put you on the spot there too much.
That's okay. No, it's kind of makes you be a little bit creative, because I think I came in to this conversation thinking, and generally in my career, thinking about this concept of the stewardship of an organization in addition to the kind of executive function of it. But likewise, in our personal lives, we have to be thinking about the stewardship of the well-being of our lives, right? Like we ultimately want to do well in the long term. We don't just want to kind of look flashy this week and then have nothing next week if things don't go perfectly. And so that is also that mirrors the idea that we ought to make decisions in our personal life with the concept of long-term stewardship in mind. So are we orienting our lives in a way that's responsible? Yes, but also focuses not just on maybe what we have, but what's important to us, and are we looking to thrive in those ways? Are we pursuing those things, or are we just kind of copying what everybody else has and does? So I don't think it's wrong that you brought that up. I think it's just reflective of my own limitations that I don't. That's a business concept that I entertain all the time, but it does. I think you're right in that it does apply in our personal lives. That stewardship has a huge role. And when you think about it that way, stewardship makes a lot of sense. Of course, I should think about, the long run. Like I shouldn't just think about what I need today. I got to think about tomorrow and in the future, and maybe my retirement and all that, my kids, all these things. That's an example of stewardship, and kind of bringing it back to business. What I'm saying is, businesses should think like that too. We should be thinking about our long-term legacy in terms of, are we healthy? Are we doing something important? Do we feel like we're thriving and helping other people thrive, even our staff thrive and the people we interact with thrive? And are we going to have a reputation for integrity that endures into the future? So no, thanks for the question.
A very interesting take on it, and stretched my thinking on it as well, because like I said, I probably think less about it from the business side than maybe I should have. And that we're all CEOs of our own lives, essentially, is what I took from this. And looking at these factors and educating ourselves as much as we can not only allows us to show up better for ourselves, and then we can produce more and be more available to others, because we take away a lot of that worry. And it is a kind of a dichotomy, because the Stoics would say, and don't worry about tomorrow because you can't control it. All you have is now. But reality sets in. Well, there is a time, right, where we're not going to work every day of our lives, and we're not going to have provisions and that sort of thing. But you did a great job, and you provided a really good segue, because my next question from what you were saying was this whole idea of stewardship. And can you define what that means to you? Because everyone has a different definition of what stewardship is, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so stewardship is the part of the role of somebody who has authority in any sort of organization. That could be a business, but doesn't have to be. It could be a government. It could be a not-for-profit. It could be a media company, like any sort of institution, an education institution. Anybody who's got authority there to kind of affect the system and its direction and its orientation and that sort of thing. It's the concern over the long-run integrity, protection of values, and legacy of that thing. And I don't mean that legacy like just what it is its reputation, but really what is the value of the thing you're passing on over time, and recognizing that these things do endure beyond. So for my company, I should be thinking this thing ought to endure longer than my tenure. And so I am a steward of the organization in that it shouldn't live and die with me. It should be something that I can then kind of hand over and say, here you go, I've taken good care of it. I hope you do too. And it's so important to think that way, because we want the continuity of success over the course of our careers. But also, I think when we're succession planning, we should be thinking about people who would be good stewards of those things. And that does happen. I think there's a crisis right now in business. At least I know in Canada. I couldn't appraise this in the States, but I would suspect it would be a similar situation just based on demographic changes. There are people who have companies and they want to retire or at least scale back, and they want to find somebody who can do it. But they don't. They have a hard time articulating this in my experience. But what I think I'm hearing is them say, we could find somebody who who manages the numbers. But that's not really the whole thing we're looking for. We also have a strong belief about why this company exists, why we cared about it for this long. I've stewarded it for this many years. I really want to find somebody who I can trust would and I think what they usually say is uphold the values. And that's kind of the colloquial way to kind of pack in this concept of stewardship. So I hope I've answered that sufficiently.
Yeah, no, that's great. So when you are looking at the long term versus the short term, how do you find the balance there? Because my observation alone is a lot of businesses, and at least in my industry, only look at the short term. They don't even consider the long term. And then so when the long term or these industry downtrends or, these things happen, you're kind of flat footed. And then it doesn't yield results for either the organization, the employee, the leader. Everyone loses in that case. So
Yeah.
for you, how do you look at that balance between long term and short term in your leadership approach?
That's a fair question. I think maybe one thing, maybe this is a good time to clarify something. Stewardship is not like a rejection of or anti-profit. So let's think about profit to an organization the way that oxygen works for a person. You need it to live. Companies need to be profitable to survive. That's just critical for survival. But in our lives, it would seem totally natural to say that the purpose of our life or the aim of our life is not oxygen. It is a thing we need, but it isn't the thing we're aiming at, right? That's not the thing that gives it meaning. So likewise, I think what we're saying is, do the things you need to be profitable to survive till tomorrow. Of course, you have to do those things. But while you're making those types of decisions, there is a scale, because these things are not, do I make a decision for the long term or the short term? Do I make an executive performance decision or a stewardship decision? It's, am I making a decision that considers both of these things simultaneously in the same decisions? So it's not more, it's the same. It's just overlapping, right? They contribute to the same decision making. So I got to do the thing that makes me profitable. We have a certain level of performance. We have to accept that we need now. Again, we're not going to be fluffy, right? We have to achieve it. We have to do it because people expect it from us and because without it, we die. So profit is necessary. While we're doing that, are we also making decisions about that don't achieve the profit in a way that's destructive in the long term? So when we think about how does the decision we're making to be a performance company now, what is the long-term consequence of that decision? Because sometimes there's a few different ways we can achieve performance right now. And what happens if one way to make that decision raises profit by 1% and it destroys long-term integrity in the next 10 years significantly? It's hard to monetize that change, but it's likely more than the 1% you're getting right now. And so you just have to make these kind of trade-offs, and it's really hard. I'm not pretending to have like a calculator for how that works, for like a morality calculator. And if anybody has one, I'd be interested. But I haven't got that. But what I do know is that they're just two parts of the same role. They're not two separate things. They're not two different types of answers. They're just things that go into the same answer. And they're, for me personally, in my decision making, they're the way that I make decisions so that if the outcome isn't what I hoped, I mean, I can learn from it, but I don't have regret about it. I don't say, well, it went wrong and I knew better than to do that thing, or I knew I was kind of damaging us in the long run, and here I am now paying the price, and I can't write this now because the damage took 10 years to unfold. The correction's going to take 10, 20 years to produce, and we're not going to make enough money now to correct that. So I wish I would have made better, sounder decisions for the last 10 years. So I hope that makes sense. It's not a short or long-term decision. It's acknowledge the short-term need, consider the long-term impact, and try to make a decision that meets the short-term need in a way that not only doesn't damage the long run, but could actually contribute to it, right? So we've had a supplier who, within the last year, we had a supplier who passed on a price increase. They called me personally and said, hey, we communicated to your team, there's a price increase coming. I think it was like 6%, which is fairly significant. 6% price increase on all of our materials to your company. And I just wanted to call you because if there's any reason why, if you're unhappy about that, please let us know and we can have a talk. And I thought, Well, it's interesting because we haven't even pushed back, and they're kind of saying like, "Hey, tell me if you need us to eat this more than we are." And I thought, I just told them, "Hey, listen, like, you're our partner in this. We're all part of the way that customers get their stuff. We want you to be healthy, so you're still supplying us tomorrow. 6% is 6%. Or if that's the truth, don't lie to yourselves about what it costs. Give us the 6%. We'll pass it on. We'll win or we'll lose together. If we all find we're losing business, I'll tell you that. We'll all come back down together, but we should share in the reward and in the risk here." So that's a decision, for example, that we could have been more profitable in the short term by pushing back and saying we won't take on this price increase that we're getting from our supplier. We could be more profitable for that. But what am I orienting the company towards if we keep doing that to our good suppliers? So that's the practical kind of feet on the ground example of what I'm talking about.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. And your explanation was really on point. And I don't know if I'm right or I'm wrong, but what I took from it, where we circle back to values and decision making, and like we said earlier, sometimes we throw around the word values. I think values start establishing standards. And those standards are those rocks that you're not going to move on. You know, it's like what, and I think this is where the long term and the short term kind of blend, because values alone, if they're undefined, aren't going to get you there because they can change. But a standard that you base on those values is going to be your point. And so, you know, to make it a simple explanation that my brain can learn, if you're trying to do weight loss, for example, you know, your standard is, I'm going to live my life this way. So a short-term decision would be, a piece of cake comes your way. Like, do you say yes to the cake or do you not? Well, does it meet the standard for my long term in the short term? And again, that's a very simplistic way. I know you're an economist and you're thinking way big brain than I will ever be. But I think that's very important, both in business and your personal life. What do you value enough to make a standard? And then these decisions between short and long term, like you said, with your partner, we can do this, we can eat it, or we can, you know, or you could have just arbitrarily said, no, make it 2%. But like, you had that relationship. And I'm assuming that relationships like that take a very long time to build. And there's a lot of trust between the two organizations. But your standard was, in the long term, hey, like you said, we'll either gain or lose together, which I kind of like, because you didn't waver in that moment. Like you just stayed true to it. And anyways, I'm kind of rambling there, because that like you kind of brought something that I've been thinking about lately together, and I think that's the perfect example, at least in my mind, and I hope I'm conveying it to the listener as well. But any final thoughts you want? I mean, this has been a fascinating discussion. It's a little different than what I normally talk to people about, but man, I drew so many self-leadership truths from this, and I know that wasn't your whole intention, but the way we run our businesses is the way we kind of run ourselves. And a lot of times people try to improve themselves, but then do something differently when they go to their organizations. And I don't think that's possible. I think the way you live when you're alone, I mean, a lot of people say this, like, true character is what you do when no one's looking. But I believe that what we do in business can influence our personal lives, and what we do in our personal lives can influence our business lives. And I want to thank you for bringing that connection, at least to me, because it's often, as we said earlier, that your executive responsibilities, a lot of times you lose sight of the human factors, and one of those human factors is yourself. And I hope you don't fall into that trap, and I hope no other listener follows into that trap, but I'm assuming that most people are kind of like me. Sometimes you get caught up in the business and you lose yourself. And I think that's what you're saying, the opposite. You just got to have that whole approach to how you approach, your business life, because like you said at the beginning of the show, you gotta be comfortable going to sleep at night. So I'll give it over to you for the last word. Any closing thoughts you've got?
Yeah, I think while we're all facing in these imperfect realities and trying to make decisions, to your point, that don't just reflect that, we should be constrained to some extent by our values, but in practice, what does that mean that we won't compromise about? I think that's a fair point. We have a responsibility in businesses, I think, to recognize that if you're an authority figure in a business, you are shaping the conditions for somebody else's, at least their working life, if nothing else. I mean, they're coming into the workplace every day, or they're logging into the workplace every day, and they're interacting with this community of people. And if we recognize that when we make the way that we behave and make decisions in our companies is going to meaningfully affect people's lives and maybe their ability to even pursue a thriving life, then it starts to sound a little bit more like there's a moral duty here. Now, it's not to say that a person in a leadership position is fully responsible for how everybody's life turns out. I'm not saying that at all. But I am saying that for somebody to pursue a good life, they often have to have certain types of safety and certain types of things present in the environment that they live and work in. And what can we do to contribute to that? So we can create a safe work environment. We can create a predictable work environment that has integrity and trust. We could even give back to the community in a way that makes for a safer, higher integrity environment out in our communities, so that people have even collectively, even outside of the organization, the ability to thrive even more. And this is something that if we adopted kind of wholesale, could be a benefit for our staff and for how we feel about ourselves and for society as a whole. So I think that's really important. Yeah, I think maybe we should leave it there. I think we could go on quite a bit longer about this, but to keep it simple, we'll just say that it's a good idea to take the relationship between our decisions and how we shape the conditions that people work in. And so stewardship should be something we consider on top of just executive function.
Yeah, we're going to have to get you back on the show because I enjoyed this conversation very much. And for those who are listening, please comment. Tell me if this is something that you like, because we'll definitely can have more conversations like this and bring more people on, because this was real, this was raw. So thank you for sharing your opinions and your observations. And again, both me and Angelo, we're not here to tell anyone how to live their lives, just give you something to think about, put it in your toolbox and see how you go. So thanks again, Angelo, for coming on. And for all you listening, I'll see you next time.